Hello, welcome back to the channel, and here we go with the first book for the year, McCaffrey's Dragonsdawn. This is book 9 of the Pern series, according to Goodreads, but really it makes more sense if you read it after the Survey Pern, which is in the Chronicles of Pern, the first fall. And there's a reason for that, because there's a story that takes place in the Chronicles of Pern that is basically the expedition, where they're looking for planets that can sustain life, human life, really. And they come across one in particular, and they basically pencil it out. I'm going to read it because I did read this, but it was a few days back. But Pern, the letters, stand for Parallel Earth Resources Negligible. And then they added a little C in the top corner of the report, and it says that it means it's suitable for colonization. So now that brings us into this book. And before I get into this book, I just want to first, again, ask, please like, subscribe, help me with the push to 1,000 subscribers. You'd be helping me out a lot. Leave a comment down below. Turn on the notification bell. I always comment to people as soon as I see them there. So now back to this series. I tried reading Dragonflight back in 4th grade, which was a long time ago, and it went way over my head. I didn't get it. Stayed away from it for the longest time, and now I wish I didn't, because this book was really good. It's written in 3 parts. And I guess before I get into the parts, I should explain, because I've done a little bit of research into this, so I kind of go in knowing what to expect a little bit, is that there are 2 different kinds of time that you can use in the Pern universe. There's the after landing, or AL, which starts with this book, and then there's what they call the passes. And what that is, and it'll get into part 2, is there's a red planet that gets into Pern's orbit every 250 years. And when it does that, it tends to make a whole mess of a lot of stuff. And I'll get into that as we get into part 2. But part 1 is basically called landing. And what that section really is just, people waking up. It takes about 200 years after the expedition of Pern. So basically, they've been traveling, and most people have been asleep for 14 years, and they're waking up, and they're trying to get everything together, so they'll be ready, so they can get on to Pern and start colonizing it, see what's there, what they can use, what kind of habitat's there, what kind of life, what kind of resources are on the planet. So that's really the first part, and we start to learn about some of the characters. One of the main characters, Sorka, you meet her first as a little girl in Landing, and it's kind of fascinating to watch the relationship between her and Sean blossom into parts 2 and parts 3 of the book. But at the end of part 1 is where they discover the dragonettes. They're little dragons like you see on the cover of the book. They're not big. You obviously can't ride them, which might make some people scratch their cheek a little and say, but why is it called the Dragon Riders of Pern? Well, we'll get to that. There's a lot going. And then part 2 is called Thread. And this is where we learn about the red planet that gets into Pern's orbit every 250 years or so. And when that happens, there are these storms that happen that's called Thread. And when it hits the ground, it leaves these like grubby little things on the ground, and they eat anything that's alive. So like vegetation, grass, plants, livestock, can even take out human beings and the dragonettes. And what they find is that the dragonets, they can breathe fire, and that's one way to basically kill thread before it hits the ground, is fire or to drown it in water. So fire and water is the way to take it down. So in part 2, they start to look at, okay, well, we've got these dragonets. Can we make bigger dragons? Can we make dragons where maybe people can ride them? And we can now fight more from the air instead of fighting it from the ground or in these ships, these little shuttles that aren't going to be running forever. And they do this whole bioengineering thing, and there's 18 eggs that hatch. And what happens is there's an impression that is made. The dragon chooses which person it wants. So there's a whole bunch of young people basically sitting around this circle of white sand, basically waiting for the eggs to hatch and seeing who the dragons will go to. Kitty Ping is the one that bioengineered this, and what none of them seem to know, except for her, is that male dragons would go to male riders, female dragons would go to female riders. But Sorka and Sean are chosen by 2. And what I love about this too is, I mean, I love dragons, and I always have, and this at least puts dragons in a good light. They're not the bad guys. They can communicate with humans through telekinesis. They can go. They can teleport. Basically, they find. And what I found was, as I was reading this and kind of going, I'm like, this seems a lot like Christopher Paolini's series of Aragon with the dragons. And it's like, yeah, but this was written way before then. I mean, Dragonflight was originally in 1968. So it kind of made me think, Paolini was pulling from, not just from Tolkien, when you think of some of the creatures and some of the wording, but he was pulling from Anne McCaffrey as well when it came to the dragons and how they communicate. I think Paolini's dragons are a little bit more fancy, more show than the Anne McCaffrey dragons are, but hey, you gotta start somewhere, and she did a great job with this. The third part of the book is called Crossing, and this is where, when they land, they have this basic area where they are all living. I mean, there's stakes where people are living. You have charters and stakeholders, and people go and they find their land, and they put their stakes right there, and they own however many acres of land that they reached in a contract, and they go from there. And once that happens, there's no centralized government. There's just autonomy. And it's not until the fall happens, and this is the first fall that we see. So this book takes place during what would be called the first pass, which brings the first fall. There's, I think, a first pass, a third pass, a sixth, and a ninth pass in the whole series, but I'm not 100% sure. I'll have to look at that again as I'm reading these in chronological order. You can read them in publication order. It probably makes sense too. It's just, you will discover other things later and be like, oh, so that's how it happened. I'm just doing it in chronological order. So basically, this is book 9, but I'm reading it really as book 1.2 because I kind of started the Chronicles of Pern by reading the Expedition one. But the crossing, when they're in the landing area, there's a volcano that comes up, and I'm trying not to give too much away, but they basically have to evacuate. So the crossing is them moving from landing to the next area where they're going to, which is basically just called the fort. It's not named anything yet. It's just the fort. Um, and the Dragon Riders at this point, all they're really being used for is to transport goods from one place to another. Well, as it turns out, the Dragon Riders start to learn that their dragons can do some things other than talk telekinetically. They can also teleport, which means, okay, we can get to point A from point A to point B real quick. And they found that basically every area they could get from point A to point B in 8 seconds using dragonettes. Would that work the same with the dragons, the bioengineered dragons, that they had to find out? Also, would they be able to breathe fire the way dragonettes can? And you find that, the dragonettes, they basically eat firestone. And after consuming enough of that, they're able to breathe fire. And they become, at the end of the book, the Dragon Riders of Pern, as they're able to do their first battle against the Thread, which I will say this too, it's also interesting, is that the Thread is non-intelligent. It's not really a living organism. It's more like a system that just comes out of this planet. And they're like people who have theories that are wishing that like it's coming from people who coming from things that are intelligent, or that it's an intelligent source in itself. It would explain things a little bit better. But it's not. It's every 250 years when the two planets get into each other's orbit, these Oort clouds happen, the OORT, Oort clouds happen, and it brings about these falls of thread. So they call them thread falls. And again, it's every 250 years that it happens. This book basically takes place over the course of about 9 years. So when you reach the end of this book, you're basically at, after landing, 9, maybe 10 years. And then, for me, I'll be going back to the Chronicles of Pern, the first fall, to pick up the other 3 or 4 short stories that are in there before really getting into like the real meat of it. But I gave this a 5-star on Goodreads. I found, like I said, in parts 2 and 3, I didn't want to put it down. And I just kind of had to because my eyes were just not letting me do it anymore. But it's been a long time since I've read a book, fantasy or sci-fi, or any book for that matter, that has kept me really gripped. That's really made me wonder what's going to happen next. Because once you hit part 2, if you can make it through the landing is slow. But once you get to part 2 and you get into Thread, it's event after event after event after event, and things just keep happening, and there's really no pauses, and it just makes it for a great read. And McCaffrey, I give you a big kudos because you've done great work with creatures that I like. Obviously, I go by Book Dragon, so obviously I like dragons, and she put him in a great spot. This is a great book. Again, 5 stars for me on Goodreads, and I recommend it. If you have not read this series, I recommend starting, again, basically the way that you're going to see it in this list. This is going to appear as book 1, but Chronicles of Pern, you're going to want to read the first story in there before you get into this story, Dragonsdawn. But yeah, check it out. To me, this was a great book. If you've already read it and you got any comments, anything that you remember specifically, anything that I missed here, leave it below. I'd love to hear from you and maybe start a discussion thread about this, because it was a great book. So yeah, but as always, again, I ask you to please like and subscribe. Help me on that push to 1,000 subscribers. You'll be doing me a big favor. I love doing this, and you liking, subscribing, and leaving comments, it lets me know that you enjoy what I'm doing, that you're getting something out of it as well. Also, turn on the notification bell so you know when new videos come up. So yeah, until then, until the next book, keep YouTube literate, and God bless.